Hi, this is Mike Carter, Boy Maker as you know me on my YouTube channel. Been a little while since I've done a video, so thought I'd do one today on how I make my Cowboy Dagger. And this is a popular design that it's actually pretty much a copy of an authentic Old West dagger that was made in the late 1800s. And since I'm also into Western action shooting, we try to be authentic, and I started making these knives, and they've been popular among the cowboys and a lot of other people too. The Cowboy Dagger is one of the few models that I make on a regular basis. And since I do make several of them, I did make a plastic template to go by so that they're all pretty close the same. I mean, since they are handmade, they'll vary a little bit, and I don't worry about it if they vary. You know, one's a quarter-inch longer than another or something like that. They're handmade knives. I don't try to be a machine. So I'm going to take this template, and today I'm going to start with, I'm going to make these out of a bar of 154 cm. This is 1/8 inch thick, and this is a 1.5 by 18 inch bar. I can get 2 of these knives out of this with a little bit of waste, not a whole lot. So I'm just going to show you the process here on how I do it. And you know, I do all of my knife making by stock removal. I don't forge the blades. I start with the bar of the blade steel that I want and the thickness that I want. And this has already been forged when it was formed at the factory and went through the hot rollers and everything. So it's this is stock removal. Basically, I'm going to cut out the design and grind away everything that doesn't look like a knife. So let's get started. Now, as I said, I've got a plastic template I use since I make several of these. So basically all I'm doing is I'm putting this on my steel and tracing around it with a Sharpie. And since I am tracing outside the lines, or outside this template, I want to cut on the line or inside the line in order to stay pretty consistent in the size. As you can see, I can get 2 of these blades on this 18 inch by 1.5 inch bar of steel. So now that I've got my pattern traced out on this bar of steel, I want to start cutting it out. I'm doing this on my Wilton vertical bandsaw. This is a metal cutting bandsaw, and the metal cutting bandsaw is different in a couple of ways from a wood bandsaw like you would get at Home Depot. First, it runs much slower than a wood saw, and I'm using a bimetal blade where the teeth on the blade are harder steel than the back part of the blade, which is more flexible. You know, it does generate a lot of heat, so you want to run it slowly, and it does have some special coatings on the drive wheels to help stand up to the heat that this blade's going to generate. So we'll get started cutting. First, since I am cutting 2 blades out of this, first thing I want to do is just go ahead and separate the 2 blades. Also, one thing I want to do here, almost forgot here. You see these little shoulders here, that's where my guard is going to rest, and I want those to be even. So one thing I'm going to do is go ahead and use my square against the square edge of this bar and mark that, a straight line across. That way when I cut these shoulders, I know I'll be cutting them straight and even. Also, to separate these, I'm going to cut a diagonal line right through here to separate these two blades. But since this is a bandsaw and I can cut on a curve, what I'll try to do is bring this cut right down like this and go ahead and cut that one side of this blade. Now, rather than cut all the way back here and then have to come back in and cut up close to the handle again, I'll go ahead and make this cut right here for the shoulder for my guard. So when this cut comes back and meets that, they'll separate, and I've already got one side of this blade profiled. There you can see in that one cut, I not only separated these two blades, but I already cut one side of that blade. So there's my rough cut blade. Next, I want to go to my disc grinder and just clean up the profile a little bit. Take off these high spots and just get it closer to the profile of the blade. Okay, there we are. Rough cut and pretty much profiled. Now this is a rather simple design, but one important thing that I wanted to note here, if you're doing something like this, remember this blade is going to have a guard on it. It's going to slide up and rest on these two little shoulders here. Now since that guard is going to be a piece of metal with a slot cut in it, it's going to have to slide over this tang all the way up to right here. So when you're grinding this down and profiling it, you want to make sure that this part of the tang is not wider than this part. Otherwise, if you cut your slot wide enough to fit over this and then it gets up here and this is narrower, it's going to be loose. It's going to go back and forth. So you want to make sure this is nice and straight and even or else even tapered a little bit toward this end. Because remember, you do have that guard that's going to slide up over this tang, and you want a good tight fit all the way around. Now what I'm going to do, since this steel's been laying around the shop a little dirty, I'm going to do a quick surface grind on this to clean it up. Then I'm going to redraw, take my template and redraw my pattern on here, make sure everything is right with a fine tip marker. And then I can go ahead and start drawing my, my grind lines on here. I'm just using a 220 grit belt here, and I'm just going to lightly knock this scale off of this blade. Okay, I'm going to show you something, another important thing about doing stock removal. When you buy this steel, it's in the annealed state. And after it's been hot rolled and everything, it's annealed and it's pickled, actually in a pickling solution. And you will find some light pitting on the surface. That is quite common. See, there is some pitting. It's not very deep, but I want to go ahead and get that out. So I'm going to go to a 60 grit belt and take this out and then clean it up with a 220 grit belt. Okay, I ground the face of this with 60 grit and then 220 grit. You know, if you have a surface grinder, it's great for doing this. You can do it on a disc grinder. I've just gotten used to doing it on the wheel. But the purpose was I wanted to get those pits out of the blade from the annealing process. And you can see I didn't worry much about the handle. That's going to be covered up later. In fact, it doesn't hurt to be a little rough. Helps. I've used a coat of epoxy under my handle scales, so leaving it a little rough actually makes the epoxy adhere a little better. And mainly I'm worried about this area, the ricasso, and down the center of the blade. Of course, the edges are going to be ground down, ground away anyway, so I don't worry too much about that. But I want a good clean finish here and down the center, because if those pits are in there, when I heat treat the blade after it's hardened, it's going to be that much harder to get them out. So I want to go ahead and do it now. And now that I've got a good clean surface, I'm going to mark my outline on here one more time with the template, just to make sure I've got everything right. One other thing I like to do is I use a variety of steels, and sometimes, especially if I'm making a blade that's just going to be for inventory, I might start on one and it might be weeks before I get back to it to finish it. And then I'll go, oh no, I forgot what kind of steel this is. So I've started stamping them right here on the tang that will be covered up by the handle. But you can see this is 154 cm. And so when I do come back to this to finish it, you know, I know what I'm dealing with, And of course that will be covered up when I put the handle on it. So I'm just going to trace my template on here one more time with a fine tip marker. And I may need to go back and profile a little bit more. Now that I've got a good clean surface. And I can see I'm pretty close on this. I need to take a little bit off right here. Need to bring these shoulders back a little bit. But I'm pretty close. Okay, now that I've got my profile cleaned up, I've got the shape about where I want it. I want to double check the width of my tang, because I do have to slide that guard up over it. And I'm just a hair over 3/4 there. And it looks the same here, so I'm good with that. So the first thing I want to mark is where my guard's going to sit. Now, I've ground these edges are flat and straight here, and then they should start tapering down at the same point here. So I can lay my square across that flat and draw a line across those shoulders. I want to make sure those are even. And that looks pretty good. Next, I want to measure down 1/2 inch . And that's going to be my ricasso. And I'm going to bring that line on around the edge here, so I'll see where my blade grind is going to start. There's my ricasso. Now then, I want to draw a center line down the center of the blade. And if everything's straight and true, this should go right from the point right up through the middle of where I marked my pinholes. Another thing you can do here is, I know this blade is 1 inch wide, actually just a fraction over. I could also make a mark here at the center point here and use that as a guide to line that mark up, line my ruler up with the point, and with that mark, that'll let me draw a line right up the center of the blade. That way I know if I drill my pinholes on that line, I'm drilling in the center of the handle, and then I've also got something to measure where my grinds are going to be. I want to bring those grinds up to an equal distance either side of this line. And I'll do the same thing on the other side. Some people like to coat these blades with blue machinist dye and then actually scratch their lines into it with a scribe. Either way works fine. Now we need to mark our grind. And I'm going to grind these just about 1/4 of an inch deep. So you can see my grind is going to come up this far on both sides. And I find it an easier way to mark these is by clamping this in the vise. I'll show you how I do that. Here I've clamped it in the vise, and I've got my square set at 1/4 inch. So now I can just ride that square along the edge and ride my pen along with it. And I've got my grind line. And there you have our grind lines. Which will be equal distance from the edge and equal distance from our center line. Now we have one more thing to do before we start grinding. Now then, one other thing I need to do before I start grinding is find the center along this edge. So I'm grinding, I know I'm grinding equal distance from each side down to the center. And to do that, I've got a little edge marking tool. You can see it's got a little tip right there. You can adjust the depth of that tip. And I've already got it set for 1/8 inch steel, so it's actually going to scribe a line at 1/16 of an inch. And if you want to make sure you're centered, you can make a little mark and come back from the other side and mark it again, and if it's centered right, you should have a single line instead of 2 lines. So let me go ahead and mark this. You'll be able to see it a little better. And there you can see my center line. So when I'm grinding, I want to grind down to that line or near it. Actually, I leave the edge a little thick before I heat treat. And then I'm going to have to grind it again after heat treating. And that's when I'll finish it and take it down closer to that line and actually get down to my final edge thickness. So now we can grind our blade. Okay, we're ready to grind our blade. And I'm going to start off with a 60 grit belt, and then I'll, once I get it all pretty much ground, I will go and clean it up a little bit with a 220 grit belt, and then I'll heat treat. Daggers are a little tricky to learn. You know, with a single edge knife, you got to get two grinds the same, that you want the same depth, want them to meet in the middle, right on your center line. But with a dagger, you got to get four grinds symmetrical. Basically, you're grinding two knives. So it is a little tricky. It took me quite a bit of practice to get it down. Now, I'm not grinding very deep on this one since I'm only going 1/4 inch in on the blade. And I am grinding with a 10-inch wheel. So it's going to make a shallow hollow grind. When you're only going 1/4 inch, you're not going to get much of a convex grind there. And I've made my mark. See where my ricasso was? I've made my mark here on the edge. So when I'm looking down on the blade, I can see that's where I want to start my grind. Notice when I'm coming across the wheel, I'm trying to stay, as Gil Heaven taught me, imagine an imaginary line across this wheel. So I'm trying to keep that edge on that line, and when I come up here where it curves, I'm curving the blade so that it stays on that imaginary line also. And that gives me a good even grind as I come up toward the tip. I'm watching my center line here. I don't want to get too close to that, but I want to keep it even, an even space between the center line and my edge here. And I'm getting about as close to that as I want to get before heat treating. So I'm going to start tilting, bringing the blade up more so the wheel's grinding more in this area. We'll come a little higher on the wheel and get that grind start going a little deeper. Letting off pressure a little bit when I get right out to the tip, because that will heat up much faster than the rest of the blade. You don't want to burn that tip off. I'm also dunking it and cooling it in water. Trying to use steady, even pressure, trying to keep this grind line as straight as possible. If I do see I got a little curve in it, I'm getting a little off, I can slow down or put a little more pressure in that area, try to bring it back in line. Getting pretty close to my upper grind line there. You can see I'm resting my knees, I'm resting my elbows on my thighs. That's what helps keep me steady. I've got this swivel stool so I can pivot back and forth. Now take a look at after every pass to see how close I am. See that if I'm straight. Okay, so we have one edge just about done with the 60 grit belt here. So you can see I'm pretty even here where the ricasso and the grind start. I'm pretty evenly centered on my center line down here. I brought it right up to my grind line here, and it's pretty straight. Now it doesn't have to be perfect at this point because I'm going to come back and refine it with the 220 grit belt. Now one thing I'll point out here is most people have a dominant side. In other words, it's going to be easier to grind going one direction or another. Now for me, I happen to find it easier going from right to left. So it's easier for me to grind this grind than it is this one going left to right. But you may have noticed I did this grind first going left to right. That's my weak side. And the reason I do that is it's easier for me to match that weak side grind with my strong side, rather than do the strong side first and then try to match that with my weak side. And that's just one little thing that I've learned that helps me keep everything nice and even. So now we've got to go back and do 2 more grinds and turn this single edge knife into a double edged dagger. Okay, I'm about finished with my 60 grit grind. Got my grinds pretty straight and even. See, they come evenly to a point here. Point is centered. So now all I really need to do is make a few passes with the 220 grit, clean those up, and that's about all I need to do before I heat treat. After heat treating, I will come back and start again with 220 grit and further clean it up and refine the grind, narrow it down. As you can see, I am leaving it a little bit thick before heat treating, and this does help prevent warpage during heat treating. The thinner it is, the more it's likely to warp. There you can see the 60 grit on the bottom and the 220 grit on the top. Okay, we have this one browned, ready for heat treating. Only thing I have left to do is I need to drill my holes for my handle pins. It's something you really need to remember to do before heat treating, because after it's hardened, you won't be able to drill those holes. The steel will be as hard as your drill bit. And I have forgotten to do that, so it's important to remember to get your everything drilled that you need drilled before heat treating. But I have ground this at 60 grit and then came back and refined it with the 220 grit. I used to go from 60 to 120, but I found that with annealed steel, when it's still in its relatively soft state, I can jump from 60 to 220 grit, and it just saves wearing out a few belts. You might have to make a few more passes with the 220 grit, but it works fine for me. But here we are. See, my grinds are evenly spaced from the center of the flat of the blade to the edge, or 1/4 inch grinds on each side. Come to a nice centered point on both sides. My grinds are even here. You can see where they meet the ricasso, that's a nice even spacing there. My center line on the edge is clearly visible down both sides, so I know I've taken both sides in an equal amount and got my grind nice and centered down the blade. And I've checked that it's straight and even. So that is the rough grind. After heat treating, I'll come back and start grinding again and do the finish grind. As I said, the only thing I have left is to drill my holes for my handle pins. And on this, I will be using these Loveless bolts. I'm going to use brass ones on this. And these are a very secure method of attaching a knife handle. These are basically a screw with two threaded collars. In this case, these collars are 5/16 inch diameter, and the screw itself is 5/32. So what I'm going to do is drill a 3/16 inch hole, and that will give me a little room, little wiggle room where you can adjust these just slightly if you need to. And these do take a special drill bit that cuts a recessed hole and really creates kind of a countersink. Makes a very secure method of putting a handle on, and I will show that in detail when we get to the point of putting the handles on.